Well, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Chris Borthwick, I'd like to very warmly welcome you to St Paul's Cathedral today, as we gather to remember and to give thanks for Rosemary Crossley, as we comfort one another in our grief, and as we acknowledge her deep impact, both on those who gather today and many others besides. And we are not just gathering here in the cathedral, but we are also joined for this celebration of Rosemary's life by friends, clients, supporters, and others in many places as they join us via our live stream. So to those who are joining us via the electronic airwaves, a warm welcome to you as well. We gather here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, lands that were taken, not ceded. And we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to First Nations people with us today. My name is Heather Pataka. I'm the precentor of the cathedral, and I'll be leading the service in the main today, assisted ably by Father Jim Minchin, who is a friend of Chris's and also one of our volunteer chaplains here at the cathedral. And as we begin, I'll lead us in prayer. O God, who brought us to birth and in whose arms we die, in our grief and shock, contain and comfort us. Embrace us with your love. Give us hope in our confusion and grace to let go into new life. And this we ask through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Well, in the course of our service today, we have a number of people giving tributes to Rosemary, and we begin with our first tribute by Leanne Lego.
Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Leanne Lego. I'm the current president of the Committee of Management of the Anne MacDonald Centre. I first met Rosie over 20 years ago. I was a young mum of 2 kids, the youngest of which, Mitch, has severe disabilities. He attended early intervention at around the age of 4, and I remember one morning going into the centre excited because Mitchell had learnt how to drink out of a straw. I eagerly was telling his physiotherapist and demonstrating his new skill, but she looked at me and she said, "It's all very well, but it's actually just a reflex action." And it didn't mean that he knew he was thirsty. And I was a bit gobsmacked. Mitch, God bless him, picked the cup up in front of him and took a big drink and put it gently down on the table, looked at the physio and grinned. It was at that point where my quest began. I wanted Mitch to be surrounded by people who took joy in his achievements, big or small, and saw in him potential, not just pity. That quest took me via an old Reader's Digest article to the Deal Communication Centre and Rosemary Crossley. Others will speak about Rosie's history with Annie Mac, and with the Deal Communication Centre, which is now known as the Anne MacDonald Centre, or Annie Mac as we like to call it. Since its inception in 1985, Rosie has contributed more than any other one person to the rights of people with little or no speech. She has a long list of achievements, which I'm sure you'll all hear about today. But with all of her remarkable achievements, what she was most proud of were the Animac clients themselves, writing and publishing their own stories and poetry, gaining independence with their communication, or producing the most delightful of dinosaur tales. And the clients all loved her. They would settle into the chair with barely any objection, much to the astonishment of the parents, and then work for an hour solid. Rosie herself was larger than life. She was determined, some may even say stubborn. She was involved in some epic battles over the years, not least of which was her daily battles with the office printer. Her love-hate relationship with technology is the stuff of legend. She could create the most amazing iPad apps to encourage communication and create fun games. But every single time she tried to play a movie, find an email, or print the minutes, it resulted in at least half an hour of mild cursing, mumbling, and refusals of any help. No piece of equipment was going to get the better of Rosie. Every committee meeting could have gone on for hours. Her story was so engrossing. My main task as president primarily was to back up Chris and try and steer Rosie onto the next agenda item. Succession planning in particular was a subject that was very difficult to broach with Rosie. The idea of starring in training videos or any talk of someone else writing application grants or training up a young speech therapist resulted in some very creative dodging. As always, with the latest gadget, toy or communication device, and she would scour the $2 shops for anything low-tech or cheap to entertain or teach the Annie Mac clients. She was very creative. But any time spent away from the direct clients was time she resented. She needed to do it all, and for the most part, she did and she could. Some people are night owls, some wake with the sparrows. I'm convinced Rosie was both and actually just ran on coffee alone, that thick, strong and dark coffee that she loved. And of course, the occasional glass of champagne. The Annie Mac Christmas parties were legendary. There was always an abundance of food and drink for all, from her particularly impressive TARDIS fridge, which I do believe was bigger on the inside than it was on the outside. She had a wonderful knack for picking out the best Christmas presents, always practical, whimsical, environmentally friendly and fun. I remember one year during the droughts in the 90s, everyone was receiving a water pump. There were microwave bags to cook potatoes and old-fashioned apple corers and peelers. Unfortunately, Rosie, for some reason, always got me a plant every year. I did manage to kill every single one of those plants. And the Christmas bags also always came with scratchies. The deal being, if we won anything over $50, it had to be shared with the centre. And in those 20 years, I don't remember ever anyone winning more than $5. Rosie was a lover of art and supported many local artists, including some Annie Mac clients. The Finn family Moomin troll from the books by Stove Jansen were also a great feature of their house, and with little ghosties peering around the corners, if anyone knows those books. Rosie was a therapist, a teacher, a researcher, writer, advocate, lobbyist and app developer. She travelled the world, rubbing shoulders with politicians, disability leaders, TV and movie celebrities. Her large body of work influenced thousands of people's lives, and her story brought hope for a better future for all people with disabilities, not just those without speech. I would like to close today with a short tribute from my son Mitch. Rosie was the greatest. She always talked to me as if I was intelligent. She felt everyone deserved to communicate the best way for them. Her great feelings of deliverance placed her clients in a good standing for life. Only with Annie Mac could I have the life I know. People felt so frightened before Rosie. I know I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. Our next tribute is from Dr. Philip Graves, who's coming forward now as we look forward to hearing more of Rosemary's life. Thank you. Is this a good height for you? Just do that. So
Probably. Rosie was kind, generous to a fault, seldom seeing the bad side of anyone, although she could occasionally be acerbic about some narrow-minded so-called neurotypicals. She was honest, smart and very direct. In the disability field, she was always on the edge of mainstream orthodoxy. The mainstream could not accept the way she showed them up, and she knew they needed prodding. With people who had a disability, she didn't even see the disability. She just ploughed through and focused on the person underneath, doing what she could to overcome the resultant restrictions in opportunities. I met her at St Nicholas Hospital in 1977. She was introduced as the play leader, dressed in black, sitting on the floor, working with a child. I was just starting a placement towards the end of my training as a paediatrician, and I thought I was God's gift to paediatrics. Rosie looked me up and down and saw through me immediately. Over the next year, she set about putting me straight. She taught me that cerebral palsy was not just a motor deficit, and that what mattered was the person behind the deformities and deficits. I learned about Christy Brown, who wrote My Left Foot, and Joey Deacon, the author of Tongue Tied, and her group of beanbaggers, so named because due to their severe deformities, all they could sit in was a beanbag. Rosie selected them from the patients at St Nicholas Hospital by applying tests of simple cognition, such as holding different objects in her hands and asking them to look at the object which she described by name, shape, colour, etc. She then set about developing their communication skills. Anne MacDonald was one of this group, but did not initially stand out. Later, Rosie noted her interest and responses on a serendipitous trip to an exhibition of paintings at the National Gallery, hence my tie. They subsequently worked on each other's communication. Initially, Rosie offered choices using pictures and eventually an alphabet board. Anne's pointing was not always clear, and her choices had to be confirmed with yes and no responses. All of this was done in the context of opposition. St Nicholas was an institution for the severely and profoundly mentally retarded. Its residents were not able to communicate at these levels. Rosie was not genuine. Anne had turned 18 in early 1979. That and a series of events at St Nicholas led her to asking Rosie to arrange for her to see a solicitor. This created a furore at the highest levels. Rosie stood firm against her superiors at the hospital, the Mental Health Authority, and the Health Commission, and eventually won out. Through speech therapist Margaret Batt, who sadly died 2 weeks ago, and her barrister husband John, they went to Mallison's, one of the leading law firms in Melbourne. At St Nicholas, in front of solicitor John Dethridge, Anne spelt out, "Work to get us out." There were 2 resultant court cases. The first concerned a writ of habeas corpus against the Government of Victoria and the Mental Health Authority for holding her against her will. And the second addressed the issue of Anne's infirmity in order to enable her to sign a contract with Penguin Books. They won both. Significantly, both presiding decision makers, Justice Jenkinson and Senior Master Charles Jacobs, went out of their way to comment favourably on Rosie's integrity. The habeas corpus case was decided exclusively on the evidence provided by others without Anne appearing. Master Jacobs was asked to resolve the issue of infirmity. He felt he had to go further and devised a test comprising asking Anne questions whilst Rosie was outside the courtroom, then bringing Rosie back in to facilitate Anne's responses. Anne was resistant to this, strongly resenting any suggestion that her communications were not genuine. After Anne produced 2 erudite but irrelevant responses to two equally erudite questions, Master Jacobs cleared the courtroom and of everyone except Anne and gave her a stern talking to, pointing out that she owed Rosie more than this. Rosie had stuck her neck out for her, and it was about time she came down after a high horse and cooperated. We know this because Master Jacobs subsequently told us. On the final test, Anne was given just 2 words, string and quince. She slowly and laboriously spelt out S-T-R-I-N-G and then Q-U-I, each letter having to be confirmed with her yes-no responses. And with each letter, Rosie becoming more despondent. Then, with an impish grin, Anne spelt out T, short-circuiting quince to quit. It brought the house down. Vale, Rosie, we have lost a teacher, inspiration, advocate, and friend. Thank you.
Friends, I invite those of you who are able to stand to do so as we sing this hymn, Who Would True Valour See, which describes the life and hard work of a pilgrim, and you'll understand as we sing through why this particular hymn was chosen for today, representing the hard work of someone like Rosemary through hard times and good. Let's stand and sing. Please take a seat. Jan Ashford will now speak to us about Rosemary, the advocate.
Rosemary, amongst others, employed me in the early 80s for a position at Communication Aid Users Society, now known as Communication Rights Australia. It was my first exposure to the disability rights movement and the energy and passion of Rosemary Crossley. As a social worker, I was trained in the theories of empowerment and rights, but through Rosie's mentoring, I was able to see how these theories developed into practice and how barriers within the community and the people's attitudes impacted on people's rights and their lives. Rosie and Annie became Communication Rights Australia's first lifetime members as an acknowledgement of their support and commitment to the organisation and its values. Over 35 years I worked with Rosie, we developed a close and sometimes edgy relationship. The external environment was not always friendly to the message that it was a right of the individual to have the means to communicate. Professionals from other areas viewed some of Rosie's approaches as problematic, yet this did not deter her commitment to assisting her clients, to the people. Her strength to persevere was a gift to the individuals. The driving force and platform that underpinned Rosie's action was an understanding of communication as a human right and a knowledge of the laws that enshrined and protected these rights. Rosie knew communication was fundamental to every aspect of life and could see how members of the community were being locked out, disadvantaged, and abused, and they couldn't protect themselves and express what was important to them. People with communication disabilities often are restricted from realising their right to receive, seek, impact information and ideas because of their difficulty in communicating. So communication disability impacts on all aspects of a person's life: education, employment, socialising. Rosie fought to provide an avenue for as many people as possible to achieve the right to communicate. How refreshing it was to work with someone who was steadfastly assuming capacity in an ocean of those who steadfastly assumed incompetence. The community of those who can't rely on speech has suffered a great loss, and so have we all, and the community is a less place for it.
Dr. Douglas Bicklin is going to come and speak, or Tolly, as I've been said. Yes, come and speak, won't you?
So I'm reading this on behalf of Douglas Bicklin, Emeritus Dean, School of Education, Syracuse University, New York State. So, and a long friend of Rosemary Crossley. I learned of Rosemary 40 years ago, first in 1983, upon reading the book Annie's Coming Out, which I promptly assigned as required reading in my introductory teacher education class at Syracuse University. Then, in 1986, I met her, Chris Borthwick, and Anne MacDonald face-to-face when I came to Victoria for work on school inclusion. It needs hardly be said, life was never quite the same after that. On that first evening together, I asked Rosie and Anne to sign my copy of their book. Anne scrawled a large X and then pointed to letters on a letterboard as Rosie transcribed the message. To Doug, with best wishes from an Aussie battler and her battle axe. Yes, the battle axe was the battle axe was Rosie, and we are all the better for it. 18 months later, on my next visit to Melbourne, Rosie welcomed me to Deal, now the Annie MacDonald Centre, where I had my first ever conversation with autistic non-speaking individuals. That visit left me incredibly excited, not just for what I observed, but also for what lay ahead. Getting the best out of students always requires dialogue. When the teacher invites dialogue, teacher becomes student and student gets to be teacher. Rosie revelled in discovering who her students were, their interests, their personality, their humour and their dreams. Over the past 4 decades, I had many opportunities to watch Rosemary coax one client after another into communication. Typically, these sessions brought tears to my eyes, as when a 17-year-old's first sentence was the simple plea, "Can I come again?" And another student typed, "I'm not retarded," and one announced, "I can read." Rosemary discovered that a very large number of her clients had learned to read by virtue of living in our everyday language-rich world of television, magazines, signs, posters and product labels. She uncovered the fact that these previously voiceless people, children and adults alike, had been learning in silence. It turns out that they knew so much. One Saturday at the centre, I watched as a student was given a subtraction problem that would result in a negative number. The student hesitated momentarily and then typed, "But it's less than naught." Rosemary came to know that not being able to speak was not the same as not having anything to say. As she explained to me in 1989, the condition of not being able to speak emanated from apraxia, in other words, difficulty of carrying out intentional action. At the centre of Rosemary's brilliance was her ability to ask fundamental questions and to make useful assumptions. Among her assumptions, two seem most important. One, assume everyone wants to communicate, and two, assume the person is intellectually competent. It is far better to overestimate than underestimate a person's ability. She referred to this as presuming competence, a concept now embraced by neurodiverse activists and progressive advocates. Regarding fundamental questions, again, two seemed most critical. What technology, curricula, settings and strategies or approaches might best enable a non-speaking person to communicate? And yes, Rosemary did embrace technology. She was not only an early adopter of technology, but usually the first adopter in Australia. The other fundamental question she asked was, how do any of us know what another person knows? This was transformative. How do we know what a person knows? When I first met Rosemary, the prevailing belief system was that nearly 1/3 of all people with autism, those who are non-speaking or with highly limited speech, were intellectually impaired. Education authorities administered so-called intelligence tests to non-speaking children. When they failed to respond effectively, psychologists labelled them intellectually disabled, ID, or mentally retarded, MR, and consigned them to segregated disabled-only schools and day centres. The thought was that through behaviour modification, non-speakers might be trained in self-help skills, trained to behave themselves in public settings, and trained to indicate basic needs, for example, to ask for food or go to the toilet. But Rosemary unmasked the fact that mental retardation and intellectual disability are failed explanations for the difficulties that many people with autism and cerebral palsy experience. Someone must have once said, "It's as if a person's mind is held back," or "it's as if the person's mind is disabled." Later, the first part of those phrases, "it's as if," got dropped, replaced by the assertion that people were retarded or disabled. Rosemary showed us something different. Those concepts, MR and ID, are not real. They are just metaphors, albeit terribly unhelpful and harmful ones. Rosemary's legacy is filled with reports of non-speaking disabled people who have gone on to earn university degrees, to win academic and other mainstream awards, to write autobiographical books, to appear in films, to give keynote addresses, and most importantly, to enrich the experiences of those around them. Their lives demonstrate that the only way to know what people know is if they can represent themselves. That was Rosemary's work, making communication possible and bringing disability justice to the world.
Our second hymn is the hymn Jerusalem, and again, if you're able to stand, please do, and we sing together. do take a seat, won't you? We're going to now hear a reading from Annie's Coming Out, and it's going to be read by Alice Borthwick, Chris's niece. Come forward.
My diary entry gives a fair idea of the kinds of problems we were having. We started well, though slowly, but I tired quickly and was very conscious of the time and got crabby when things started to get confused. Anne's arm seemed to be tight. However, every time I got mad, she was suddenly able to move it perfectly well for the next few letters in a row, but before going back to the bottom left corner where she would point to 4 or 5 letters in a row, but say no to each of them when asked. Recently, our rapport on communication seems to have disappeared, and it all seems very slow and difficult. Part of this is probably because I'm tired and tense, but part is certainly due to the fact that Annie's face isn't providing the amount of feedback it used to. Her old yes or no at the board, squeezed tongue yes, tongue unmoved no, seems to have disappeared. And to get a clear yes or no takes ages. Her eyes are also not as expressive as they were. It's as though she is shutting me out, applying a protective coating perhaps. I feel there are 2 obvious explanations for the problems that Annie and I have been having over the past few weeks. 1, she doesn't like me. Or 2, she is afraid that I don't like or am rejecting her. I spoke about these possibilities to Annie, saying that if it was 1, I was sorry, but she'd just have to tolerate me until she was communicating independently, and that it certainly wasn't 2. I said that the closest relationships weren't always sunshine and roses, and that, for example, Chris and I often had periods of coolness lasting some time, and not to worry about resenting me, or whatever. That was normal. I got a sympathetic response when I said that it was a difficult time for both of us, and I doubted if either of us was sleeping well, and that this would obviously exacerbate things. I explained that I usually get angrier with people that I am close to or not, because I have high expectations of them. Kissed her goodnight particularly affectionately, goodnighted the others. It sounded suspiciously as if Annie was trying not to cry as I left her. Calm and controlled personal relationships are not my forte. I don't want the responsibility inherent in close ties, which is the main reason I don't want to have children. I really like and admire Annie, and I don't see our association as just being a temporary one. However, at the moment, my relation with her is being poisoned by a why me feeling on my part, which I feel I am being most unsuccessful in concealing, brought about by my knowledge that they are a responsibility which I can't, and in most ways don't want to, shed, and which seems to daily increase in weight with no end in sight. Sisyphus and I have a lot of gripes in common. On Monday, Anne spelt, "To love was having difficulties I didn't see. Tell Chris I love him too." As far as I know, it was her first explicit emotional commitment.
Annie and I spent more than an hour together while she gradually programmed her answers to just 2 questions.
How do you feel about being able to communicate through a voice box like this?
It's rude, especially if it makes people think about abilities rather than concentrating on disabilities.
Anne MacDonald was born with the most terrible cerebral palsy. She'd been a difficult breech birth, and the doctor who delivered her reported that she'd suffered severe brain damage. She was left seriously physically handicapped, and it was thought mentally retarded too. When she was 3 years old, she was sent to an institution for the mentally retarded. St Nicholas Hospital in Melbourne is the end of the road. It's reserved for the worst cases. Only the most profoundly mentally retarded are ever sent here. A lot of them die. Anne was in here for nearly 15 years. This is part of a record tape that was made while she was in the hospital. This was made when she was 16 years old. Now, as you can see, she was still being dressed in nappies. And when these pictures were taken, she weighed just on 14 kilos. That's a little over 2 stone.
It hadn't been contemplated that a St Nicholas resident would ever ask or would ever be able to ask to leave, or that as an adult that they would have the right to leave.
Annie MacDonald is 21. For most of her life she was written off as a mindless vegetable. But 3 years ago she won her freedom after an historic and bitter court battle. The Victorian Supreme Court judged her capable of communicating and fit to manage her own affairs.
One of the things that became absolutely clear, and in fact was clear to me from when I started to teach Anne, was that she was smarter than I was. The law was that if Anne had been able to walk out the gate, no one had the right to stop her. But as she couldn't walk out, no one else had the right to push her. So she had to go to court. Lawyers said, look, if she does take this action to win her release from the hospital, the judge isn't going to let her out, whatever her rights are, unless she's got somewhere to go. And we sort of looked at each other and said, well, I guess we'll have to take it.
And today she took her first step in gaining her high school certificate.
And we'd chosen not to have children. This was a bit of a shock to the system. Someone who was, after all, totally physically dependent.
A toast to a feat some predicted could never be accomplished. At 33 and suffering cerebral palsy, Annie MacDonald has defied those who branded her intellectually disabled, today graduating from Deakin University with a Bachelor of Arts.
Initially, we said to Anne, look, we think we can promise you 10 years, and at that stage, if you want to leave us earlier than that, obviously you can, but at the end of 10 years, I think you should be looking for somewhere else.
I love you all. I wish I could use my voice to thank you, but if you'd hear my thoughts, you would know how much I value your friendship. I'm thoroughly spoiled with such wonderful friends, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
Well, hey, it didn't turn out like that, and she stayed until she died. Brodie's typical of a lot of children in that her difficulties with speech and handwriting have meant that she hasn't been able to show what she knows. Okay, capital of Tasmania. When she came to Deal first, I started by giving her a multiple choice reading task. And we progressed from her demonstrating that she recognised single words to being able to read short sentences to being able to read paragraphs. Do you know the names?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, good. Okay, this is really hard. Whose name could also be a horse? A horse. Which one of those words could also be a horse? Yes, absolutely.
Well, the first time we came and we could understand that she could read and understood things.
It's hard, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It was, her mum was here with me as well, and we were just shocked, beautifully shocked. But it's just because we just didn't know that she could communicate.
Funny how I find words when I type, but not when I talk.
I see a lot of boys and girls like you, Cyrus, where your speech gets in the way of you showing how clever you are.
Next to speak to us is Chris. Come forward, won't you?
I first met Rosie at university, the ANU. Her previous boyfriend had failed all his subjects at the end of first year and I moved in. We won the University Art Prize that year, I remember, with a print of Rosie's nude body covered with white shoe cleaner and laid down on black paper. She was, then and always, game for anything. And we stayed together for the next 57 years. Rosie enjoyed life and luckily only remembered the good times afterwards. She said frequently that we were just so lucky. She got what she wanted out of life mostly, and she should have had more of it. We fought like cats and dogs all the time, though never about anything particularly significant, but it wasn't long before I realised that she wasn't just a wonderful partner, she was a great woman. Rose was, and this sounds pretentious, which of course Rose never was, but it has to be said, Rose was a world historical figure. Rose was, above all things, somebody who could see what was in front of her nose. This sounds obvious, but for thousands of years, people hadn't. They identified difficulty in speaking with difficulty in thinking. Working with Anne MacDonald showed Rose that this wasn't true. You saw that. And once she knew that, she couldn't be hassled or bullied or intimidated out of her beliefs. They called it a fraud. Rose knew it wasn't. They called it a miracle, and she knew that it wasn't that either. She fought, together with Anne, through all the courts there were, and once they'd won, she thought she'd proved her point and could move on. She did move on, and her opponents didn't. Over a long working life, Rose saw about 3,000 clients at least, and helped nearly all of them. And a lot of them are here today to speak for her. She knew more about people with communication handicaps and how to help them than anyone ever has. And that was part of the problem. A lot of people, particularly academics, couldn't do what she did because they couldn't relate. They couldn't come down to the same level as their subjects, couldn't genuinely be partners, couldn't relate as equals. They couldn't make that human connection, and they couldn't earn the trust of the person who couldn't speak. They couldn't overcome, basically, their academic conditioning. And when they couldn't do it, they said that that proved it couldn't be done. And we hadn't realised back then just how hard it was going to be to turn the ship around. In this country, around the world, the management of people diagnosed with intellectual disability is $1 billion industry, and if you believe what Rose says, everybody concerned, special schools, institutions, employment centres, trainers, everybody concerned is doing everything wrong, and everything has to change. She soon found out just how hard it is to persuade somebody of something when their job depends on their not understanding it. She made the biggest discovery ever in the field of psychology, and she should have got the Nobel for it. The discovery wasn't facilitated communication, of course, facilitated communication training. That was just a method, something to be used when called for, but a distraction in the bigger picture. But the discovery that people who couldn't speak were intelligent, just about all of them. But Rose didn't want to be a pathbreaker or a celebrity or a guru or a leader or a tall poppy of any sort. She just wanted to work with her people, people with little or no functional speech. But the world wouldn't let her. Once she'd taught somebody to communicate, she then had to go on to persuade their school and their university and their country and everyone around them to let them go on communicating. She had to train parents and carers and attendants and trainers. She had to write articles and books and screenplays to get the word out. And I have to say that for all her great work, she didn't manage to get the word out in her lifetime. She's left a lot to do for us who come after. 100,000 Australians, one person in 250, roughly 20 million people around the world have little or no functional speech, and nearly all of them are now underestimated and frustrated and must be freed. There's almost no task in the field of human rights that is more important. And without Rose, every person without speech knows that their job has suddenly become even harder. She knew that, and she was sorry. When death approached, she accepted it bravely and with humour. "It doesn't look as if I'm leaving here alive," she said. "Can't be helped." And later, "Your fly's undone, Chris." See, I am still good for something." She never gave up, and she never compromised, and she never doubted you. She was working till the end in a bed at the Royal Women's Hospital, where the nurses were wonderful. She found that one of the nurses had a child without speech, and she was able to assist with boards and books and advice about iPad apps. And that was about 2 weeks before she died. We owe her, and we have to carry on her work. I've said it's a tough fight, but I believe we'll win. Rose said back in the 70s that people without speech were smart, and that's true. And over the last 50 years, nobody's really refuted her or indeed engaged seriously with her arguments. The whole theoretical edifice of intellectual disability is a sham, rotted out and unable to stand up to any degree of scrutiny. It survives only because nobody dares to think about it seriously. The emperor has no clothes. Rose saw that, and I hope that soon everybody will. We have to carry on the fight. We have to win one for Rosemary at every level where each of you is trying to achieve communication. We need to win, and we need to, when we win, we need to remember Rosemary started it all. Thank you.
Our next reflection is from Tim Chan, who's not able to be here today, but thanks to the wonders of the screens, he'll now be speaking to us.
Deeply honored to talk about journeying with Rosemary and how she changed our deeply honored to talk about journeying with Rosemary and how she changed our lives.
The world is like the outer reaches of space, remote, cold and uninhabited, when you are not speakers. We are prisoners of silence, our teeming thoughts swirling, but without anywhere to express except inside our heads. Extreme isolation and deep loneliness are our constant companions. but life can become bearable with a means to communicate, with a voice to reach out to people who listen to what we type, to find ways to connect, to become part of the human world. In helping us find our voice, Rosemary Crossley brought us out of that darkness. In supporting us in challenging social systems that routinely dismiss and oppress divergent communicators, Rosie provided the techniques and resources for us to join the human family. In guiding us through the myriad discriminatory obstacles that exclude us, Rosie gave us the strategies to achieve our goals, like getting a mainstream education, participating in events, or independent living. What's more, with a voice, we also find deeper understanding and acceptance, not only in other people, but within ourselves, to experience meaningful engagement in our communities, as well as the give and take of relationships, the vital ingredients of a life worth living. Rosie, you never wanted us to be made over you, but your tireless and unflagging efforts to bring communication to non-speakers will be sensed, touched and felt in unfathomable ways in every community. You are our beacon of hope, an unsung hero who deserves much more than what you have so selflessly given. Those of us who had the great good fortune to learn under you all the teachers you have taught, if we hold hands, together with our social network, the ripple effects of divergent communicators will create a human chain to encircle the earth, to sustain a more compassionate and inclusive world. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Delay, Rosie, your legacy will shine bright and remain untarnished.
Father Jim's going to come and read to us from Ecclesiastes 3, a reading that Chris has chosen for this occasion, and then speak to us about those words.
A reading from the book Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what's planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away. Hear the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
You can just keep talking and I'll hold this if you like.
I fear for your sanity. This passage comes from one of the great so-called wisdom books of the Scriptures. And the thing to remember is that the wisdom that we get from the Scriptures has to be argued with. Everything that St. Paul said or wrote was contested by his contemporaries. Sometimes they caved in and capitulated to his wonderful insight, and at times they wished rid of him. One of my favourite pieces of wisdom in the Scripture is in the book of Proverbs, when it says, what's the point of having a snake charmer if the snake's already been and gone? And that's something we should always bear in mind when we're told this is sacred, this is uncontestable. Each person, each community, each place has its own mix of characteristics to be explored, named if possible, assessed, cherished and/or resisted. And best of all, at the end of the day, if it's good, to be transformed. It's a gift of God. Some things need to be dismissed as superfluous or divisive and damaging. It's a gift of God revealed to us in Jesus Christ above all. At times we can feel irrelevant to the world around us, and vice versa. The world is irrelevant to us in our journey, in our exploration. Both feelings are illusory. We need each other in a healthy way. We can be sometimes turned in on ourselves, pining intensely for quiet and respectful relationships in which the best is brought out of each other. Sometimes we pine for a safer distance between us and our interlocutor. Sometimes we're determined to work and present ourselves for fulfillment and completion in a better world, a new heaven and new earth, as the scriptures would describe it. And we are joined in our journey by the figure that can, for many people, is in the past, Jesus of Nazareth, who's opened for us such extraordinary dimensions of the possibilities and the future of life. I want to finish this brief reflection thanking God, the Word incarnate, the Word in human form, in human flesh, speaking definitively in Christ Jesus, yes, and I'm thoroughly convinced of that, but also who has been opened for us by many amazing people, including Rosemary Crossley, who's opened for us, and particularly her dear friends and her closest ones, but so many others, always with their cooperation, a world of communication, of connection that doesn't demean us, but enhances us. A word spoken with trembling and confusion sometimes, and clarity and sureness and sweetness in others. Bring me my bow of burning gold. Bring me my arrows of desire. Bring me my spear, O clouds unfold. Bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built God's loving realm in this and every God-given land. Amen.
Friends, we invite you, if able, to stand as together we sing an old spiritual hymn, Can the Circle Be Unbroken? Well, friends, as we are prepared to have our final blessing, there is, of course, a very warm invitation from Chris for everyone to join him at Beer Deluxe following the service. There are people ready to assist in directing and welcoming you when you arrive there, and so please do feel free to join and continue what was only just the tiniest small number of stories about Rosemary. It's a great opportunity to share and talk and reminisce and, of course, think about the future and who will be taking up the mantle in these things. So let me say this prayer of blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be amongst you and remain with you and those whom you love this day and always. Amen.